April 12, 1945. The city of Erfurt was still standing, which was more than could be said for most things in Germany by then. Frida Holz had not slept in 3 days. She sat in the corner of a requisitioned schoolroom with her back against the cold plaster wall, listening to the sound of artillery moving closer with each hour, like a slow tide arriving from the west. Around her, 41 other women from her signals unit sat in various states of exhaustion. Some prayed quietly. Some wrote letters they had no way to send. Some simply stared at the floor with the blank expression of people who had stopped expecting the day to improve. Frida was 21 years old. She had come from a village called Molsdorf, 12 kilometers south of Erfurt, where her father grew potatoes and kept 2 horses, and her mother made bread every Thursday morning with a technique so specific it could not be taught, only watched until it became instinct. She had joined the Wehrmacht Auxiliary in the spring of 1943 not out of ideology, but out of something quieter and less examined. Her brother Karl had gone east with the infantry. Her neighbors' sons had gone. The local party official had come to the house and spoken to her father in a tone that was not quite a question. And so Frida had gone. She had spent 2 years passing coded messages between units, her fingers learning the rhythm of the keys until it became as automatic as breathing. She was good at her work. She did not think much about what the messages meant or where they went. She was good at not thinking about certain things. In her coat, she carried 2 objects. A small photograph of her mother standing in front of the house in summer, squinting into the sun, and a thin book of German folk poetry that had belonged to her grandmother, its cover worn soft as cloth from years of handling. These were the things she had decided were worth keeping if everything else had to be left behind. Across the room, sitting very straight in a wooden chair as if posture were still a meaningful act, was Gertrude Moss. Gertrude was 40 years old. She had taught history and German language at a secondary school in Nuremberg for 11 years, the kind of teacher whose students remembered her long after they left, though not always fondly. She had joined the party in 1936, not because anyone pressured her, but because she had read the speeches and found them convincing. She had believed in the logic of it, the order, the clarity of purpose after years of Weimar chaos and humiliation. She had taught her students to believe in it, too. She had been good at that. She had come into the signals unit late in the war as an administrator, organizing personnel files and correspondence. She was precise and efficient. She did not speak unnecessarily. In the weeks since it had become clear that the war was ending badly, she had become even quieter, as if conserving energy for something she had not yet decided on. She carried nothing personal in her coat. She had burned her party membership documents 3 days earlier in the courtyard of the building, along with several years of correspondence she did not want found. She had done this methodically, watching the paper curl and blacken, and then walked back inside and washed her hands. Their commanding officer, a tired major named Schellenberg who had not shaved in a week, gathered the women that evening and spoke to them in the measured tone of a man delivering information he found personally distasteful. The American army was less than 15 kilometers away. They would reach Erfurt within 48 hours, possibly less. There would be no further retreat. The women had a choice. They could attempt to move east on their own, into territory that was either contested or already under Soviet control. Or they could surrender here and submit to American captivity. He paused. He looked at the floor. He said what he had been told to say. The Americans were not known for their restraint with prisoners. There were reports. He had heard things from soldiers who had come back from the Western Front with stories that did not bear repeating in front of women. He could not guarantee their safety. He could only tell them what their options were. He did not hand out cyanide capsules. That detail, Frida learned later, had been protocol in other units. But Schellenberg either lacked the supplies or lacked the conviction to distribute them. He simply told them their options and left the room. That night, Frida lay on a thin mattress in the dark and tried to construct a picture of what the next 48 hours might look like. The image kept breaking apart before it fully formed. She knew what she had been told about American soldiers. Everyone knew. The propaganda films showed them as loud, arrogant, racially mixed, morally corrupt, driven by greed rather than any coherent idea of civilization. The newsreels had been specific about their brutality with prisoners. She had watched those newsreels in a cold cinema in Erfurt 3 years ago, sitting next to Karl before he shipped out, and she had believed them because at the time she had no reason not to. She touched the photograph in her coat pocket. Her mother in the summer light, squinting. She thought about what her mother would say about all of it. She suspected her mother would say very little and simply make bread. Across the dark room, she could hear Gertrude's breathing, slow and controlled, the breathing of someone who was awake but had decided not to show it. On the morning of April 14th, they walked out of the building with their hands raised. The American soldiers who accepted their surrender were young. That was the first thing Frida noticed. They looked like the men who used to drive delivery trucks in Erfurt before the war. One of them, standing near a jeep with his rifle slung across his chest, was eating something from a tin with a small metal spoon. He glanced at the women without particular hostility. He glanced at them the way a man glances at something that requires his professional attention but does not personally concern him. A sergeant with dark circles under his eyes spoke to them in broken German through a translator, a thin young man who kept pushing his glasses up his nose. They were prisoners of war. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They should not attempt to run. They would be given water and food at the collection point, 2 kilometers west. If anyone was injured or ill, they should say so now. He said it the way a tired man reads a list. Frida waited for something else to happen, for the tone to change, for the moment when the mask dropped and the brutality her commanding officer had warned about revealed itself. She kept waiting as they were loaded into American trucks. She kept waiting as the trucks moved west through the April countryside, past farmhouses that had been marked with white flags hung from windows, past orchards beginning to bloom, as if the season had not been informed of the situation. The violence never came. Gertrude sat beside her in the truck, straight-backed, her face arranged in an expression of careful neutrality. When a young American private offered them water from a metal canteen, passing it along the row of women without ceremony, Gertrude accepted it and drank and returned it without acknowledgement, as if accepting water from an enemy soldier was something she had simply decided was beneath the dignity of a reaction. Frida drank and tasted nothing but water, cold and clean, and felt confused in a way she could not quite name. The journey from Germany to the United States took 3 weeks and covered a distance that still seemed abstract to Frida even as she was living it. England first, a transit camp outside Southampton where they slept in wooden barracks and received meals that were plain but real. Then a converted troop transport across the Atlantic, 7 days on gray water under gray skies, the coast of Europe disappearing behind them like something being slowly erased. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. On the ship, Gertrude began her habit of explaining things away. The food was adequate because the Americans needed them healthy for propaganda purposes. The bunks were real because the ship had been built for soldiers and had not been converted. The guards were polite because they had been ordered to be polite while cameras and observers might be watching. Every comfort had an explanation that preserved the structure of what she already knew. Frida listened to these explanations and said nothing. She was learning, in those first days, that Gertrude spoke to fill silence rather than because she had been asked. It was a schoolteacher's habit, she supposed. The classroom always needed a voice. What Frida noticed instead of explaining were the small things. A guard on the ship's deck reading a paperback novel with a creased spine and a bright illustrated cover, the way people read books they had chosen for pleasure. A cook whistling something tuneless while he worked. 2 American soldiers arguing cheerfully about something in a way that suggested neither of them was afraid of the other's opinion. In Germany by the end, she had noticed, people had stopped arguing. Even small arguments. The risk was not worth calculating. The train from the New York port carried them southwest for 2 days. Frida pressed her face against the window and watched the American landscape pass. It was the intactness of it that was most difficult to absorb. Not the wealth or the size, though both were evident. Simply the fact that everything was whole. Every bridge they crossed was a real bridge, carrying the train's weight without apology. Every town they passed through had buildings with roofs and windows and front doors. Children stood at level crossings and watched the train go by with expressions of mild curiosity. No rubble. Mile after mile, no rubble. Gertrude sat across from her and looked out the window for a long time without speaking. Then she said, quietly and precisely, that the Americans had routed their rail lines through towns that had been prepared for their arrival. It was a calculated display. They would not show the damage and poverty that certainly existed if you knew where to look. Frida turned this explanation over for a moment. Then she looked back out the window at a white farmhouse sitting in a green field under a clear sky, a dog lying in the sun near the front step, and said nothing. The train arrived at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, on a warm afternoon in early May. The women climbed down from the cars and stood in a flat landscape so vast and unbroken that the horizon seemed farther away than horizons had any right to be. The air smelled of grass and something sweet and dry that Frida had no name for. The sky was enormous. An American sergeant stood before them in a pressed uniform. He was a tall man with an unhurried manner, the kind of person who seemed to have decided long ago that raising his voice was rarely the most effective approach to any situation. He welcomed them, through a translator, to Camp Gruber. He explained the basic rules. He told them that the camp doctor was available if anyone needed medical attention. He told them dinner would be served at 6 o'clock. He He said all of this as if it were routine, because for him it was. Frida looked at Gertrude. Gertrude was watching the sergeant with the expression she used when she was gathering information and reserving judgment. Her eyes moved carefully across the camp, the wooden barracks, the wire perimeter, the guard towers, the American flag moving slowly in the Oklahoma wind. Whatever she was looking for, she had not found it yet. Neither of them had. But they had arrived. And the sky here was very wide, and the ground was flat and still, and somewhere inside the nearest building someone was cooking something that smelled of nothing Frida could identify, but which was, unmistakably, real food. She touched the photograph in her pocket. Her mother in the summer light. She followed the line of women toward the barracks, and behind her, precise and unhurried, came Gertrude Moss. Still watching. Still explaining things to herself in a quiet voice that was beginning, just barely beginning, to sound like it was working harder than it used to. The barracks at Camp Gruber were made of wood and smelled of pine resin and sawdust, the smell of something recently and deliberately built. Frida stepped through the door of Building 7 and stopped just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust from the bright Oklahoma afternoon to the cooler interior light. There were beds. Not shelves. Not boards elevated off the floor by wooden legs. Beds, 2 levels high, each one with a mattress that had been filled with something softer than straw, covered with a wool blanket folded precisely at the foot. Frida walked to the nearest lower bunk and pressed her hand flat against the surface. It gave slightly under her palm. She pressed harder. It gave a little more, and then held. She had slept on a wooden bench for the last 6 weeks of the war, covered with her coat, her boots still on in case she needed to move quickly. Before that, a cot with a canvas surface that sagged in the middle and made her back ache by morning. She stood with her hand on the mattress for what was probably too long. Behind her, Gertrude set her bag down on an upper bunk, smoothed the blanket with one efficient gesture, and said that American prison camps were known to present favorable conditions in the initial period of captivity. It was documented practice. The comfort was calculated to produce cooperation and psychological dependency. She said this the way she might have explained a grammatical rule to a classroom, informative and without particular emotion. Frida said nothing. She sat down on the lower bunk and felt it hold her weight. The first morning began with a sound Frida had not heard in 2 years. Running water. She had woken early, before most of the other women, and followed a narrow path to the latrine building as the Oklahoma sky turned from black to a pale gray pink at the eastern edge. Inside the building, she found a row of porcelain sinks, each one fitted with 2 taps, one marked with a red indicator and one with blue. She turned the blue tap. Water came immediately, cold and clear, without hesitation, without the sound of pipes struggling or the brief brown discoloration that had preceded whatever water eventually arrived in her unit's facilities in the last months of the war. She put both hands under the flow and held them there until her fingers were cold, watching the water run over her knuckles and disappear down the white drain. Then, because no one was watching, she turned the red tap. Hot water came within 30 seconds. She stood alone in the latrine building in the early Oklahoma morning, with hot water running over her hands, and felt something shift in her chest that she could not immediately identify. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more disorienting than gratitude. It was the specific vertigo of encountering something ordinary that should not, according to everything she understood about the current state of the world, exist. This was a prisoner camp, a detention facility for enemy combatants. And it had hot running water as a matter of course, the way a house had hot running water, the way people lived when things were going well, when civilization was functioning and resources were available. She turned both taps off and dried her hands on her coat, and walked back to the barracks as the sun came fully over the flat horizon. She did not mention it to Gertrude. Breakfast was served at 7 o'clock in a long wooden dining hall with screen windows that let in the morning air. The women moved through a serving line where American kitchen workers, 2 of whom were German-speaking prisoners who had volunteered for the assignment, filled their plates with scrambled eggs and toast and tinned peaches from a large flat can. Frida accepted her plate and sat down and looked at it. The eggs were real eggs, not powdered, not extended with anything, scrambled with a small amount of fat that had browned them slightly at the edges the way eggs should be. There were 2 pieces of toast with a small portion of real butter, not margarine, already beginning to melt in the warmth of the room. The tinned peaches were sweet and cold alongside the hot eggs in a way that made no particular sense, but was immediately, simply good. She ate slowly and completely, the way you eat when you are paying attention because you understand the food might mean something. Gertrude ate her breakfast efficiently and without visible reaction. She drank her coffee, which was real coffee and not the grain substitute that had been passed off as coffee in Germany for the last 2 years, and made no comment about any of it. An older woman sitting across the table, a former administrative officer named Brunhild who had cried for most of the Atlantic crossing, leaned forward and said in a low voice that the food must be drugged. Something in it to make them calm and manageable. She said she had read about this kind of thing. Gertrude looked at the American kitchen workers eating from the same pots at the far end of the room. She said nothing. Frida watched Gertrude look at them and file something away behind her eyes. On their third morning at Camp Gruber, they met Corporal James Webb. He arrived at their barracks at 8 o'clock with a clipboard and a calm expression, a tall man in a pressed American uniform with dark skin and careful posture, the posture of someone who had learned early that how you carried yourself in a room determined what happened next. He addressed them in German. Not halting German. Not the broken phrases of a man who had memorized a few useful sentences. Fluent German, with a slight American rhythm beneath it, but with grammar and vocabulary that were precise and unself-conscious. He said good morning. He explained that he would be their primary point of contact for camp administration, that any questions about camp procedure or work assignments should come to him, and that he kept his door open every morning between 9 and 11 for exactly that purpose. The room was very quiet when he finished. Frida watched the other women's faces. Several of them had the expression of people who had received information that their available categories were not equipped to process. One woman near the back of the room, a communications officer from Stuttgart, opened her mouth slightly and then closed it again. Gertrude's face was still, the particular stillness of someone concentrating. After Corporal Webb left the room, the Stuttgart woman said, in a voice pitched just low enough to be private, that it was impossible for a man like that to have learned German properly. Someone must have written his words out for him. He had memorized a script. Frida had watched Corporal Webb speak. She had watched his eyes move, the way people's eyes move when they are thinking in a language rather than translating from one. She said nothing. That afternoon, during the voluntary work assignment session in the camp office, Frida watched Corporal Webb spend 20 minutes reviewing paperwork with a German-speaking administrator, moving between English and German in the same conversation without pause, asking a precise question about a transit document in German and answering a question about supply inventory in English before the other man had finished responding. He did not look at any written notes. He did not hesitate. On her way out of the office, Frida stopped. She asked him, in German, where he had learned to speak it. He looked up from his clipboard. He said Ohio. He had studied German literature at a university in Columbus for 3 years before the war. He had particularly liked Goethe. He asked if she had read The Italian Journey. She said she had, in school. He said it was better the second time. She walked back to the barracks and sat on her bunk for a while without doing anything. The female army doctor was named Captain Ruth Hayward. She held her weekly medical review on Thursday mornings in a long room attached to the camp clinic, working through the prisoner roster with the efficient thoroughness of someone who regarded health as a practical problem to be systematically addressed. Frida had been assigned to her review in the second week. She sat on a white paper-covered examination table while Captain Hayward checked her weight, her eyes, her lungs with a stethoscope, the condition of her teeth and gums. The captain was perhaps 35, with short dark hair and the particular economy of movement that surgeons and very good nurses developed after years of doing precise things in small spaces. When she was finished, she wrote notes in a folder and told Frida she was underweight by approximately 7 kilograms, and that this was consistent with what she was seeing across most of the new arrivals. She would be receiving supplemental rations, an extra portion of protein at the evening meal until her weight stabilized. An American sergeant stood near the door, waiting. Captain Hayward said something to him in English without looking up from her notes. The sergeant said yes, ma'am, and left immediately to do whatever she had told him to do. Gertrude was sitting in the hallway outside when Frida emerged. She had watched the exchange through the open door. Frida saw her watching. On the walk back to the barracks, Gertrude said that the Americans used women in certain auxiliary military roles as a form of social engineering, that it was a deliberate policy designed to destabilize traditional structures. She said this in her schoolteacher's voice, even and authoritative. Frida asked what traditional structures she meant. Gertrude said the natural order of things, the way societies functioned when they were healthy. Frida thought about Captain Hayward's hands moving with absolute confidence over a stethoscope, and the sergeant leaving the room immediately at her word, and the sergeant's face showing nothing but the ordinary expression of a man given a reasonable instruction by a competent superior. She said, perhaps, and said nothing else. The library was in a small wooden building near the center of the camp. Frida discovered it on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat outside had become heavy enough to make the barracks uncomfortable, and she had gone walking along the interior paths simply to move. The door was open and she went in. 230 books stood on unpainted wooden shelves. Most of them were in German. She ran her finger along the spine slowly, reading the titles. history, novels, technical books about engineering and agriculture, a collection of German poetry that included her grandmother's favorite poet, Theodor Storm, in a clean edition with a dark blue cover. She took the Storm collection to a wooden chair near the window and opened it. The afternoon light came through the screen in long pale bars. Somewhere outside, someone was mowing grass, the sound moving back and forth in a slow rhythm. She read for 2 hours without stopping. When she left, she passed a bulletin board near the door. On it was pinned a single newspaper page, an American newspaper from a town called Muskogee, perhaps 40 kilometers away. She could not read English yet, but she recognized the layout of a newspaper front page. She recognized, from the prominent position and the large typography, that the main headline was a significant story. She stood there looking at it for a moment, then continued out the door into the afternoon. She would ask Corporal Webb about it tomorrow. That evening, just before the dinner bell, something arrived that Frida had not been prepared for. A supply truck came through the camp gate and unloaded boxes near the kitchen building. One of the German-speaking kitchen volunteers, a woman named Els who had grown friendly with several of the American kitchen staff, came back to the barracks with something cupped in both hands and a puzzled expression on her face. It was a glass bottle, dark glass, perhaps 20 centimeters tall, with a distinctive curved shape and a metal cap. Inside, a dark liquid. Els said one of the American cooks had given it to her. She said it was called Coca-Cola. She said the cook had said it was cold and good, and that she should try it. She looked at the bottle with the expression of someone who had been given a gift in a language they didn't speak. She opened it against the edge of a wooden bunk frame, the cap coming off with a small clean sound, and a thin curl of cold vapor rose from the neck of the bottle. The smell that followed was unlike anything Frida had encountered. Sweet and slightly medicinal and cold, a smell that seemed to come from a category of things she had no experience of. Els took a careful sip and blinked. She passed it to Frida. Frida drank a small amount. The cold hit her teeth first, then the sweetness, then something sharp and alive that was nothing like any sweetness she knew from home. It was fizzing slightly, alive in her mouth in a way that seemed almost aggressive for a drink, and then it was gone and left behind only a faint, pleasant warmth. She passed the bottle along. When it reached Gertrude, sitting on her bunk with a book open in her lap, Gertrude looked at the bottle for a moment. Then she took it, examined the embossed lettering on the glass with the expression of someone reading a document they had reservations about, and took a deliberate sip. She handed it back without expression, but Frida noticed that she held it for just a moment longer than necessary before letting go, as if she had not quite finished deciding something. Outside the screen windows, the Oklahoma evening was settling into a long, slow dusk, the sky going pink and orange across the enormous flat horizon, and somewhere in the camp the sound of an American radio playing something with a light, unhurried rhythm that Frida did not have a name for yet, but which sounded, she thought, like a place where things were not broken. She sat on her bunk and opened her grandmother's poetry book and listened to the music come through the walls. The work assignments began in the third week of May. Camp Commander Major Harold Estes made the announcement himself, standing before the assembled women in the morning heat with his hands clasped behind his back, and the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that clarity, delivered calmly, traveled further than urgency, delivered loudly. He was perhaps 50, with gray at his temples and the particular quality of stillness that Frida had begun to associate with Americans who held authority, not the rigid, performative stillness of German officers asserting rank, but something more settled, as if they had already decided the situation was manageable and were simply working through the details. Corporal Webb translated. Work was voluntary. No woman would be compelled to accept an assignment. Those who chose to work would receive 22 cents per day in camp credits, redeemable at the small camp store for soap, thread, writing paper, and various other items. The available assignments were kitchen duty, laundry, clerical work within the camp office, and agricultural labor on farms within a 20-kilometer radius of the camp. All work would end at 5 o'clock each day. Transport would be provided. He paused, and then added something that Corporal Webb translated with a slight smile, as if he found it characteristic of the man. Any woman who experienced difficulties with a work supervisor or felt she was being treated improperly should report it to him directly. His door was open every morning. He meant it literally. That evening, Frida told Gertrude she intended to sign up for farm work. Gertrude was sitting at the small writing table near the window, composing a letter to her sister in Nuremberg in the careful, formal handwriting of someone who had spent years writing on a blackboard. She did not look up immediately. She finished her sentence and set down her pen and said that working for American civilians was an act of collaboration that Frida should consider carefully before committing to. Frida sat on her bunk and thought about this for a moment. She said she had considered it, and that the alternative was sitting in the barracks every day thinking about things she could not change, which she did not think would be useful to anyone, including herself. Gertrude said that appearing useful to the enemy was not a neutral act, that it sent a message, that it could be interpreted as endorsement of their captivity. Frida said, quietly, that she did not think the Americans required her endorsement, that they had, by all available evidence, managed to build hot running water and a camp library and a functional breakfast program without it. Gertrude looked at her then. It was a long, assessing look, the look of a teacher recalibrating her understanding of a student she had perhaps not been watching carefully enough. She picked up her pen and returned to her letter. She said that Frida should do as she wished. She said it without warmth, but also, Frida noticed, without the dismissive finality she usually brought to closed subjects. It was the voice of someone who had decided not to argue a point she was not entirely certain of anymore, which was different from conceding it. Frida signed up for farm work the next morning. The Morrison farm was 40 minutes from camp by truck, down roads that cut through flat fields of winter wheat beginning to turn gold at the edges. Frida sat in the truck bed with 11 other women and watched Oklahoma pass at the pace of a slow walk made fast, the land enormous and unhurried around them. Everything intact, everything going about its seasonal business without reference to the events of the past 6 years. The farmer's name was Douglas Carter. He was 63 years old, weathered in the specific way of men who had spent their lives outdoors in a hot climate, and he spoke in a slow drawl that Corporal Webb, who accompanied the work details 3 times a week, translated with evident enjoyment. Carter used a great many idioms that required explanation. His wife, Eleanor, was a small, precise woman who moved through her kitchen with the authority of someone who had been running a complex operation since before anyone currently present was born. She had sharp eyes and an immediate, evaluating intelligence that reminded Frida somewhat of Gertrude, except deployed entirely in the service of feeding people rather than correcting them. On the second day of work, Eleanor Carter came out to the field at midday and told the women, through Corporal Webb, that lunch was ready inside if they wanted to come in and sit down. The 12 German women stood in the wheat field and looked at each other. Corporal Webb said, in German, that Mrs. Carter made very good food and that it would be impolite to decline. He said this with the air of a man offering genuinely useful advice. They went inside. The Carter farmhouse kitchen had a long wooden table with mismatched chairs that had been added to over several decades as the family grew and the original set became insufficient. Eleanor had set places for all 12 women, and for Corporal Webb, and for herself and Douglas. She put food on the table in large serving bowls and sat down as if this were a thing she did every Tuesday, which, it became apparent, it essentially was. There was cold fried chicken, cornbread, green beans cooked slowly with what smelled like pork, a bowl of something pale and creamy that turned out to be potato salad made with a sharp vinegar dressing that was nothing like any potato preparation Frida had encountered in Germany. Frida sat very still for a moment, looking at the food, and then at Eleanor Carter sitting at the head of her own table, passing the cornbread to a German prisoner of war with the same casual generosity she would have used passing it to a neighbor. One of the women, a quiet girl from Leipzig named Hannah, leaned close to Frida and said in a very low voice that she did not understand what was happening. Frida said she didn't either, but that the chicken smelled real and she intended to eat it. Douglas Carter, sitting across the table, said something to Corporal Webb, who smiled. Frida asked what he had said. Corporal Webb said, "He says his mother always told him you can learn everything you need to know about a person by how they behave at somebody else's table. He says he's watching." Douglas Carter looked at Frida across the table with pale, good-humored eyes and said something further. Corporal Webb translated. "He says so far he likes what he sees." Frida did not know what to do with this information. She took a piece of cornbread and ate it. At the end of the meal, Eleanor came back from the kitchen with a plate of something she called oatmeal cookies, setting them in the middle of the table with the air of a woman bestowing something worth bestowing. They were thick and golden brown and studded with raisins, still slightly warm. Frida took one and bit into it and tasted butter and oats and sweetness and a warmth that was not from the food alone. On the truck ride back to camp that evening, nobody spoke for a long time. The sun was going down over the flat Oklahoma land, turning everything gold and orange, and the wheat fields moved slowly in the evening wind like something breathing. Finally Hannah from Leipzig said, softly, to no one in particular, "Where is their hate?" Nobody answered, but Frida thought about it the whole way back. She asked Corporal Webb about the newspaper the following Thursday morning during the 9 o'clock open session at his office. She had been thinking about it for nearly 2 weeks. The front page she had seen pinned to the bulletin board in the library, the large headline she could not read. She sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and asked him what the headline had said. He He leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment, as if deciding how to explain something that required context. Then he said that the story had been a criticism of President Truman's handling of the post-war economic transition. Several senators had given speeches attacking the administration's policy, and the newspaper had covered it prominently. Frida sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "The newspaper criticized the president. By name. On the front page." Corporal Webb said yes. She said, "And the men who wrote it. What happened to them?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "Nothing happened to them. That's what newspapers are for." Frida was quiet. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she said, carefully, as if testing the weight of the words before committing to them, "In Germany, a man who criticized the government in print would be taken away. His family would be questioned. His neighbors would be told not to associate with them. I knew a schoolteacher in Erfurt who made a remark at a dinner party about the conduct of the Eastern Campaign. 3 weeks later his wife came to my mother and said he had been arrested. My mother gave her bread because she had no money left. We never heard what happened to the teacher." Corporal Webb said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I know. I studied the history. I studied it for a long time, actually, because I wanted to understand how it was possible for an educated, civilized country to allow it." Frida asked if he had arrived at an understanding. He said he had some theories. He said that fear was more efficient than violence because it did the violence's work without requiring the effort. That once people understood that speaking cost more than silence, they stopped speaking. And once they stopped speaking, they stopped thinking certain thoughts, because thoughts you cannot speak eventually lose their shape and dissolve. He said he thought that was perhaps the most dangerous thing any government could do to its people. Not the violence. The silence before it. Frida sat with this for a long time. Then she said, "Gertrude, the woman I share my barracks with. She was a schoolteacher. She taught her students to believe in everything. She was very good at it." She paused. "I think she believed it herself. I think that is different from knowing it was wrong and choosing to continue. I think it is different, but I am not certain what the difference means for what she is responsible for." Corporal Webb said, "That's a question philosophers have been arguing about since before either of us was born. I don't think there's a clean answer, but I think the fact that you're asking it means something." She stood to leave. At the door she stopped and asked, without fully planning to, "The university in Ohio where you studied, anyone could attend? Anyone who had the qualifications?" He said yes. He said he had applied, passed the entrance examinations, and attended for 4 years. He said his German professor had been a Jewish man who had emigrated from Berlin in 1936. He said he had been an excellent teacher. Frida said thank you and walked out into the Oklahoma morning. She told Gertrude about the newspaper that evening. Gertrude listened without interrupting, sitting on her bunk with her hands folded in her lap, the posture she used when she was processing something she had not yet decided what to do with. When Frida finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Gertrude said, "A government that allows its newspapers to attack it openly is a government that has calculated the newspapers pose no real threat. It is a performance of freedom, not freedom itself. The real power in any society operates beneath the surface of these permitted spectacles." Frida said, "The schoolteacher in Erfurt, the one who was arrested. Do you think he was a threat to the government?" Gertrude said, "I don't know the details of his case." Frida said, "He made a remark at a dinner party, among friends, about the Eastern Campaign. He was not a politician or a journalist or a soldier. He taught mathematics at a secondary school. My mother gave his wife bread." Gertrude was quiet. Frida said, not unkindly, not with accusation but with the genuine curiosity of someone who needed to understand. If he was not a threat, then why was he arrested? And if the reason was not that he was a threat, then what was the reason? Gertrude looked at the wooden wall of the barracks. Outside, the Oklahoma night was settling in, warm and full of insect sounds that were nothing like Germany, and from somewhere across the camp came the faint sound of the American radio, playing its evening program, something slow and low with a piano running beneath everything like a river. After a long time Gertrude said, "I taught my students that strength required discipline and that discipline required silence." She said it in the same even voice she used for everything, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, a slight roughness, as if the words were being pulled across something that resisted their passing. "I told them that individual judgment was a form of selfishness, that trusting the collective wisdom was the superior moral choice." Frida said nothing. She waited. Gertrude said, "I believe that. I want you to understand that I believed it completely." She paused. "I am beginning to think that belief and truth are two different things, and that I spent a very long time confusing them." She said it to the wall, not to Frida, as if she were saying it to someone who was not in the room. Then she opened her book and returned to reading, and the conversation was over, and Frida lay down on her bunk and looked at the wooden ceiling and listened to the piano coming through the night air and thought about how long it takes for a wall to crack when the pressure is applied not by hammers, but by small persistent questions asked in ordinary voices. Outside, the Oklahoma stars were visible through the screen window in enormous numbers, more stars than Frida had ever seen in Germany, where the cities lit the sky orange, and she lay looking at them until she fell asleep. In the morning, Gertrude was already awake when Frida opened her eyes. She was sitting at the writing table with her letter to her sister in Nuremberg, the one she had been composing in pieces for 3 weeks. She was adding something to it. Frida could not see what she wrote, but she wrote for a long time before she folded the paper and put it in the envelope, and when she pressed the envelope closed, her hands were very still and careful, the hands of someone who has written something they cannot take back and have decided not to try. November came to Oklahoma slowly, the way seasons arrived in flat country, without the drama of mountains or forests to announce the change. The wheat fields around Camp Gruber turned from gold to pale brown, and the mornings acquired a thin, dry chill that was nothing like the bone-deep cold of German winters, but carried its own quiet insistence. The enormous sky shifted from summer blue to something higher and more remote, the kind of sky that made you feel the planet curving away beneath you. Frida had been at Camp Gruber for 6 months. She knew the sound of the morning bell before she was fully awake. She knew which floorboard outside the latrine building creaked under her left foot. She knew that the Carter Farms dog, a brown hound named Roosevelt, would be waiting by the gate on work days and would follow the women across the lower field until Douglas called him back. She knew that Corporal Webb took his coffee without sugar and read a different book each week from the camp library, leaving them on the corner of his desk with the spines facing outward as if they were still in conversation. She knew that Gertrude, every night before she slept, sat for exactly 5 minutes looking at nothing in particular with her hands folded, a habit that had not existed when they arrived and which Frida had stopped pretending not to notice. She was learning English. 3 evenings each week, a volunteer teacher from the town of Muskogee named Mrs. Dorothy Hale came to the camp and sat with whichever women wanted to attend in the recreation room, working through vocabulary and simple sentence construction with the patient enthusiasm of someone who had decided that this was useful work and was going to do it properly. She was perhaps 45, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a way of correcting pronunciation errors that made you feel you had discovered something rather than made a mistake. Frida attended every session. Gertrude attended none of them, and then, in the 4th week of October, appeared at the back of the room and sat down without explanation and opened the workbook Mrs. Hale provided and began writing vocabulary words in her precise, blackboard-trained handwriting. Mrs. Hale welcomed her without ceremony, which was exactly right. Frida did not mention this to anyone. On the 15th of November, Major Estes made his announcement. He came to the morning assembly himself, which was unusual enough to produce a particular quality of attention in the assembled women, the alertness of people who have learned that departures from routine carry information. He stood at ease in the pale morning light with Corporal Webb beside him and spoke in the measured way he had, each sentence given its appropriate weight, and no more. On the 4th Thursday of November, Americans observed a national holiday called Thanksgiving. He explained briefly what it was, a day set aside for gratitude, rooted in a tradition nearly 300 years old, when the first settlers in this country had survived their first terrible winter partly through the help of people who had no particular obligation to help them, and had gathered together afterward to give thanks not to a government or an ideology, but simply for having come through it, and for the kindness of strangers. The country had been celebrating it ever since in various forms, but always with a large shared meal, always with the people around you, always with the understanding that the table was for everyone present. He said that this year, Camp Gruber would observe the holiday together. Staff, guards, kitchen workers, and all prisoners who wished to attend would share the Thanksgiving meal in the main dining hall on November 22nd at noon. Attendance was voluntary. There would be no separate sittings. One meal, one room, whatever tables they needed. He paused and looked out at the assembled women with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and means all of it. Then he said, "In this country we have a saying that there is always enough at a Thanksgiving table. I intend to demonstrate that this is not merely a saying." Corporal Webb translated and then added, in the dry, warm way he had developed over months of bridging these two languages and everything they carried. He means it literally. I have seen Major Estes's Thanksgiving table. Come hungry. The smell arrived before they reached the dining hall. It came through the walls of the barracks on the morning of November 22nd, carried on the cold dry air, a smell of roasting and sweetness, and something deeply savory that had been building since before dawn when the kitchen staff began their work. Frida lay in her bunk and smelled it, and found she could not go back to sleep. Not because of the smell alone, but because of what it was doing to something in her chest, some slow, involuntary opening she could not control. She and Gertrude walked to the dining hall together without speaking, which was how they walked most places now, the silence between them having changed in character from the careful distance of the early weeks to something more companionable, the silence of two people who have been in the same difficult place long enough to understand each other's rhythms. At the door Frida stopped. The tables had been covered with white cloths. Not cut-up sheets or brown paper, but actual white tablecloths, pressed flat. Each place was set with a real plate, heavier than the tin they used every day, and proper cutlery, and a folded napkin. In the center of each table someone had placed a small arrangement of dried corn and autumn leaves that she would later learn was called a centerpiece, a decoration whose only purpose was to make the table beautiful. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, and felt Gertrude stop beside her. Behind them, more women pressed gently forward, and then everyone was moving inside and finding seats, and the room began to fill with the sound of women sitting down carefully, as if the chairs might not hold, as if the tablecloths were not entirely real. The kitchen staff brought the food out on large platters carried by both American workers and the prisoner volunteers who had been cooking since 5 in the morning. The turkey came first, whole roasted birds, 3 of them, brought to each section of tables and carved by Douglas Carter, who had been invited by Major Estes, and who applied himself to the task with the focused solemnity of a man given an important job. The skin was dark gold and crackling. The smell when he made the first cut was something Frida had no adequate word for in either language. There were mashed potatoes in a bowl, so large it required 2 hands to pass. Real butter melting in a well at the center, going clear and golden at the edges. Green beans with thin slivers of toasted almond. Cranberry sauce, dark red and trembling in its bowl, sweet and tart at once. A thing Frida had never encountered before, and which she tasted carefully the first time, trying to understand what she was eating. Then came the sweet potatoes, topped with something white and soft that had been browned slightly at the edges. The woman sitting next to Frida, Hannah from Leipzig, said quietly that she did not know what the white substance was. Corporal Webb, passing behind their table with the ease of a man thoroughly at home in the room, heard her and stopped. He said it was called marshmallow. He said it was made from sugar and had no practical purpose except that Americans had discovered it was good on sweet potatoes and had declined to question the logic further. He said this with genuine affection, the way a man speaks about the customs of a place he loves without needing them to be rational. Hannah looked at the sweet potato. She took a careful bite of the potato and the marshmallow together. Her expression did something complicated. She said, "It shouldn't work. But it works." Corporal Webb said, "That's essentially the national motto." Then came the Coca-Cola. Sergeant Raymond Cole, a broad-shouldered man from Georgia who ran the camp's supply operations and who had, over the previous 6 months, acquired a reputation among the prisoners for being the person most likely to find whatever was needed from wherever it was stored, came through the kitchen doors carrying a wooden crate. Behind him came 2 kitchen workers carrying identical crates. They moved between the tables and placed a glass bottle at each place setting, the dark glass and the distinctive curved shape that Frida recognized now, the metal cap still on, cold from storage. The room went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of people stopping their conversations, but the quiet of people who have stopped thinking about what they were thinking about and are now thinking about something else entirely. Major Estes stood at the front of the room. He waited for the quiet to settle completely, and then he said, in a voice that carried without effort, "Coca-Cola was invented in this country in 1886. During this war, our government made sure that every American soldier anywhere in the world could buy a bottle for 5 cents, the same price as at home, regardless of where they were or what it cost to get it there. It was not a military necessity. It was a choice. We chose to make sure that our soldiers, wherever they were and whatever they were enduring, could have a taste of home. Today, you are our guests at this table. And today, for this meal, everyone drinks the same thing." Corporal Webb translated. His voice was steady, but Frida noticed, watching him, that he kept his eyes on the table in front of him for a moment after he finished, as if giving the words time to settle before looking up. Sergeant Cole, moving back through the room toward the kitchen, paused at Gertrude's table. He looked at the bottle in front of her and then at her face, and something about what he saw there made him stop. He was not a man who spoke much. His communication tended toward action rather than words. He reached out and opened her bottle for her, the cap coming off with the small clean sound Frida remembered from that first evening in the barracks, the thin curl of cold vapor rising from the neck. He said something in English that Frida did not yet fully understand. She caught only the last 3 words, because they were spoken simply and clearly, and she had learned them in Mrs. Hale's class. "It's just a Coke." He moved on. Gertrude sat looking at the open bottle in front of her. Frida opened her own bottle and drank. The cold hit first, then the sweetness, then the sharp living fizz of it. And this time she was not in the barracks tasting something unfamiliar. This time she was at a table with white cloths and cranberry sauce and a roasted turkey and a marshmallow on a sweet potato and a man from Georgia who had opened her bottle and said it was just a Coke. This time she tasted it as what it was. Ordinary American abundance. Offered without ceremony, without negotiation, without the requirement that she be grateful in any particular way or acknowledge anything in return. It was just a Coke. That was the point. That was the whole point. She set the bottle down and found that her eyes were full. Around the room, it was happening to others. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the scattered, uncoordinated way that genuine emotion arrives. Each woman at her own moment. Each one reaching whatever it was that finally reached her. Hannah from Leipzig put her hand over her mouth. The communications officer from Stuttgart looked at the tablecloth for a long time. An older woman near the far wall pressed her napkin to her face and held it there. Frida looked at Gertrude. Gertrude had not moved. She was sitting very straight, in the posture she had maintained for 40 years of standing in front of classrooms and believing she knew what she was teaching. She was looking at the open Coca-Cola bottle in front of her, and her face was doing something Frida had not seen it do before. Not breaking exactly. Not the visible collapse of tears and heaving breath. Something quieter and more permanent. The expression of a person who has been constructing an argument in their mind for a very long time and has just reached the point where the next sentence will not come, because the sentence that should logically follow is one they cannot make themselves say. She picked up the bottle. She drank from it, slowly, the way she did everything, with complete attention. She set it back down and straightened it slightly, so it sat exactly parallel to the edge of the table. Then she said, to no one in particular, in the even schoolteacher's voice she had used for every sentence Frida had ever heard her speak, as if she were reading something aloud from a text she was only now seeing clearly for the first time. They gave us their holiday. They put cloths on the table for prisoners of war. They opened our bottles for us. She stopped. She looked at the turkey, at the cranberry sauce, at the white tablecloth, at the centerpiece of dried corn and autumn leaves that had no purpose except beauty. We were told they had nothing. We were told they were desperate and broken and inferior. But they have so much that they can give it away to their enemies and still have more left. She paused for a long time. What did we have that was worth all of it? What did we have that was worth even one of these tablecloths? She did not cry. Her voice did not break. She asked the question in the same tone she would have used to pose a problem to a student, and then she sat with it the way you sit with a question you already know the answer to and are not yet ready to say out loud. Major Estes raised his bottle from the front of the room. He said, "In this country, we give thanks on this day. Today I am thankful for this table, for the people at it, and for the hope that what we share here is worth more than what brought us all to this place. Happy Thanksgiving." Corporal Webb translated. His voice was careful and clear. Outside the windows of the dining hall, Oklahoma lay flat and quiet in the November light, the fields brown and still, the sky enormous overhead, and the last of the season's warmth sitting low on the horizon like something reluctant to leave. Frida drank her Coca-Cola and ate her Thanksgiving dinner and did not try to stop the tears because she had run out of reasons to. At the end of the meal, when the pumpkin pies came out from the kitchen, golden brown and smelling of spice, Gertrude accepted a slice without being asked a second time. She ate it slowly and completely. When she was finished, she folded her napkin and placed it beside her plate in the precise way she did everything, the way a person closes a book they have just finished. She did not speak again for the rest of the afternoon. But that night, Frida woke at 2 in the morning and saw that Gertrude's bunk was empty. She lay still and listened. Through the screen window came the sound of the Oklahoma night, the insects and the wind and the enormous silence underneath everything. And somewhere at the edge of it, very faintly, the sound of a woman sitting alone at the writing table in the dark, a pen moving steadily across paper, writing something that was going to take a long time to say. December arrived without ceremony. The cold that came to Oklahoma in winter was a different kind of cold from Germany. It was drier, sharper at the edges, carried on a wind that had nothing to stop it across the flat land. No hills or forests to break its momentum before it reached you. Frida learned to button her coat all the way to the collar on her morning walks, and to keep her hands in her pockets until the sun had been up for at least an hour. She learned that the Oklahoma sky in December was a particular shade of pale blue that existed nowhere else she had been. A color so clear and depthless that looking at it too long made you feel slightly untethered from the ground. She had been at Camp Gruber for 7 months. She spoke enough English now to hold a simple conversation without Corporal Webb's help, enough to understand Mrs. Hale's jokes, enough to read a newspaper headline and grasp the outline of the story beneath it. She was not fluent, but she was no longer moving through the American world as through a room with no lights, feeling along the walls for the shape of things. Gertrude had not spoken about Thanksgiving again. She had returned to her routines with the same precision as always, the same straight posture, the same careful handwriting, the same 5 minutes of sitting with her hands folded before sleep. But something in the quality of her silence had changed. Before Thanksgiving it had been the silence of a woman fortifying a position. Now it was something else, harder to name. The silence of someone who has stopped defending a place they no longer entirely believe in, but has not yet decided where to go instead. She was still attending Mrs. Hale's English class. She had not missed a session since October. The newspapers began arriving in the second week of December. Major Estes had made the decision himself, after consultation with the camp's education officer, a quiet lieutenant from Minnesota named Carson who had a background in psychology and who had been advocating for the decision since September. The papers were American and British publications, translated summaries prepared by the Army and distributed to POW camps across the country, covering in detail the documented evidence of what had been found when Allied forces liberated the concentration camps across occupied Europe. They were placed in the library on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, every copy was in someone's hands. Frida sat in the wooden chair by the library window and read. She read about Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and Dachau and Auschwitz. She read the testimonies of the American and British soldiers who had walked through the gates of these places and found what they found. She read the accounts of survivors, translated from several languages, each one describing the same system from a different angle of experience. She read the statements of the German civilians who had lived nearby, who had seen the trains arriving and smelled the smoke, and said later that they had not known, or had not fully known, or had suspected but had not asked. She read for 2 hours without stopping. When she finished, she sat for a long time looking at the screen window and the December light coming through it, thin and pale, and completely indifferent to everything she had just read. She thought about the mathematics teacher from Erfurt, the one who had made a remark at a dinner party. She thought about his wife coming to her mother's door, and her mother handing over bread without asking questions, because questions had become expensive, which was, Frida had come to understand, how the best things tended to be. At the end of the day, as the truck prepared to leave, Eleanor Carter came out of the farmhouse and pressed something into Frida's hand. It was a recipe card, written in Eleanor's large, clear handwriting. The recipe for the oatmeal cookies from their first lunch, 8 months ago. Butter, oats, brown sugar, raisins, the temperature of the oven, the exact color they should be when they were done. Frida stood holding it, and found she could not immediately speak. Eleanor said, in the slow, kind way she had, for when you get home, so you can make something good. Frida said, in English that was still imperfect but sufficient, thank you. For the table. For all the times at the table. Eleanor looked at her for a moment with the sharp, evaluating intelligence she brought to everything, and then she nodded in the way of someone who has understood something that was not entirely in the words. On the last evening, Corporal Webb came to the barracks building not in his official capacity, but simply as a person who wanted to say something before the opportunity passed. He stood at the door and spoke to the room in German, the fluent, careful German that had undone something in all of them on the first morning they heard it. He said he wanted them to know that he hoped they would go home and find their families safe, and that the country they returned to would find its way to something better than what it had been. He said he did not say this without understanding the weight of what had been done in Germany's name, because he understood it clearly, and it was not a small thing to set aside. He said it because he had spent 7 months in the company of women who had lived inside a system that told them who to be and what to think, and had begun, many of them, the long and difficult work of deciding for themselves, and that this was, in his experience, the only thing that ever produced anything worth having. He said, I studied German because I loved the literature. Because your country produced Goethe and Schiller and Bach, and people who understood that beauty and truth were the same project. That country still exists somewhere inside the ruins of what happened to it. I believe that. He said this last sentence in the direct, unqualified way he said things he meant completely. Gertrude, sitting at the back of the room with her hands folded, said, Why would you say that to us? After everything. Corporal Webb looked at her for a moment. He said, Because you are going back, and what you do when you get there will matter. And because I think you know that now. Gertrude was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I am going to teach again. Different things this time. Corporal Webb said, I know. She said, How do you know? He said, Because a person who was not going to do that would not have been in Mrs. Hale's English class since October. Something moved across Gertrude's face then, something small and quick, and Frida realized with mild astonishment that it was almost a smile. Not quite, but the shape of one. The morning of departure was cold and cloudless. The sky overhead the pale, depthless blue that Frida had spent all winter learning. She stood beside the transport truck with her bag and her coat, and the recipe card folded carefully into the poetry book from her grandmother, and she looked at Camp Gruber one last time. The wooden buildings. The paths between them. The library door with its particular sound. The office where Corporal Webb kept his books spine outward on the corner of his desk. She thought about the first morning she had stood at the latrine sink, and turned the tap, and felt hot water come without hesitation. She thought about the dining hall on Thanksgiving with the white tablecloths and the dried corn centerpieces, and Sergeant Cole moving through the room, saying it's just a Coke in the tone of a man stating the simplest and most sufficient truth he knew. She thought about Gertrude's voice asking what they had that was worth even one of these tablecloths, and the way she had asked it, not as a defeat, but as a real question, the first real question, Frida thought, that Gertrude had allowed herself to ask in a very long time. Gertrude appeared beside her with her own bag and her coat, straight-backed as always, her face composed in its habitual careful expression. They stood together looking at the camp without speaking. Then Gertrude said, quietly and without preamble, "I owe you something." Frida said, "You don't owe me anything." Gertrude said, "You asked me questions I did not want to answer. You asked them without cruelty and without stopping. I owe you the acknowledgement that the questions were correct, and that I was wrong not to have asked them myself, long before any of this." She paused. "I was a teacher who stopped learning." That is made a remark at a dinner party. She thought about his wife coming to her mother's door, and her mother handing over bread without asking questions, because questions had become expensive by then. She thought about the Goldstein family from Molesdorf that she had known as a child, whose house had been empty since 1942, and about how she had passed that empty house every day for 3 years, and had not asked where they went because she had already learned that there were questions you paid for. She thought about all the things she had not asked. She walked back to the barracks and found Gertrude sitting on her bunk with a translated summary in her hands, reading with the focused attention she brought to everything. Frida sat down on her own bunk and waited. The barracks were mostly empty, the other women out at work or in the recreation room or somewhere along the paths between buildings, each one alone with what they had just read. Gertrude read for a long time. She turned pages slowly and deliberately, the way she graded papers, giving each one its full due before moving to the next. When she finally finished, she set the document on her knee and looked at the wooden wall across from her. After a while she said, "I knew there were camps. I knew people were taken to them. I told myself they were labor camps, resettlement facilities, places of necessary discipline during a time of national emergency." She paused. "I told my students the same thing when they asked. And some of them asked, because children ask things that adults have learned not to ask." Another pause, longer this time. "I told them that the state made difficult decisions so that ordinary people did not have to. That trust in the leadership was the highest form of patriotism. That doubt was a form of cowardice." She stopped. Her hands on the document were very still. "I taught 12-year-old children that doubt was cowardice. That asking questions was disloyalty." Frida said, "You believed it." Gertrude said, "Yes. But I have been thinking, since Thanksgiving, about what Corporal Webb said when you told me about the mathematics teacher. About how fear makes silence, and silence makes thoughts dissolve. I think I chose the silence. I think somewhere beneath the belief, I made a choice not to follow certain questions to where they led because I knew where they led. And I called that choice patriotism." She set the document on the bed beside her with the care of someone handling something irreversible. That is different from simply believing. Believing, you can be forgiven for. Choosing not to know is something else. The December light moved slowly across the floor of the barracks. Outside, the wind crossed the flat land and pressed against the wooden walls with a sound like breathing. Frida said, "What will you do with it?" Gertrude said, "I don't know yet. I have been a teacher for 15 years. I know how to explain things. I know how to stand in front of a room full of people and make something clear that was not clear before." She looked at her hands. "I think perhaps the only thing left for me to do is to go home and spend whatever time I have left explaining this. What it was. How it worked. How people like me made it possible." She said the last sentence without flinching from it, which Frida understood was its own kind of courage, the specific courage of a precise person confronting an imprecise and devastating truth. They were told in February that the repatriation process would begin in the spring. The announcement came at morning assembly, delivered by Major Estes in the same unhurried manner as every announcement he had ever made, as if the end of their captivity were a logistical matter requiring clear communication rather than an event with 7 months of wait behind it. Transport to the eastern seaboard would begin in April. From there, ships to Europe, and then the long return across a continent that no longer looked like the one they had left. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Frida struggled to name. Not happiness exactly. Not sadness. Something more complicated, the feeling of being suspended between two states, no longer fully in one place and not yet in the other, aware of both simultaneously. She walked the camp paths in the mornings and tried to memorize things without meaning to. The sound the screen door of the library made when it swung shut. The way Roosevelt the Carter farm dog smelled of mud and hay. The particular quality of the Oklahoma winter light at 7 in the morning. She spent a long afternoon at the Carter farm in March, her last work day before the transport preparation began, helping Eleanor put up fence posts along the lower field. Douglas worked beside them with his methodical, unhurried competence, driving posts into the hard ground with a heavy mallet. They did not talk much because the work required attention, but at midday Eleanor made lunch, and they sat at the kitchen table again. The same mismatched chairs, and it was both completely ordinary, slowly, and rather late. A pause. But I am learning. Corporal Webb came to tell them the truck was ready. He shook hands with several women and exchanged a few words with others. When he reached Frida, he handed her something. A small paperback book, the German translation of an American novel, with a creased spine and a bright cover. He said she was ready for it. She said she would write to him when she had finished it, if she could find an address. He said he would leave one with Major Estes' office, which would forward mail. He shook Gertrude's hand last. She held it for a moment longer than the gesture required and said, in the formal German of someone choosing words with full deliberation, "You were a better teacher than I was. I want you to know that I understand that." Corporal Webb said, "You still have time." She released his hand and walked to the truck and climbed in. Frida climbed in beside her. The truck engine started. Camp Gruber began to move away behind them, the wooden buildings growing smaller against the enormous Oklahoma sky, and then a turn in the road and they were gone. And ahead was the long way home across a country that was not broken, through a world that was trying, imperfectly, and without guarantee, to rebuild itself from what remained. Frida held her grandmother's poetry book in her lap with the recipe card folded inside it, and looked out at the flat land and the clear winter light, and thought about oatmeal cookies, about the exact color they should be when they were done.